Hi, I do hope that you've already watched the first video in this series of 4 about visiting the UK. In that, I talked about our airspace, and you're going to need to know about that to understand this video about air traffic services. So if you haven't watched it, please click on the link below and then come back here when you've done. Don't worry, I'm happy to wait for you. As I said in the last video, we do things a bit differently here, and that is at its most obvious when it comes to air traffic services. It's probably the thing that confuses visitors most. If you remain within controlled airspace, which generally means IFR in the airways between big airports, you'll not notice very much difference from flying IFR anywhere else in Europe. You'll be flying under radar control, and the instructions and clearances you get will be familiar. There are minor technical differences, one of which I mentioned in the Lost Comms video, but nothing that will bother you. It's when you leave controlled airspace that the differences really begin to show. And you will have to leave controlled airspace, even under IFR, if you're going to almost any G airfield and even some regional airports, such as Norwich and Teesside. Many surprisingly large airports are not connected by controlled airspace to the en route IFR network, and crossing Class G airspace is necessary to arrive and depart. The first big difference from what you're probably used to is that we have a variety of services provided by air traffic service providers outside controlled airspace. The UK has 4 distinct levels of provision: basic, traffic, deconfliction, and procedural. Deconfliction and procedural are only available to IFR flights. These services are only available to flights outside controlled airspace and to VFR traffic in Class E. Not that the UK has much Class E. Both we pilots and controllers are required to know what service is being provided. And we do that by entering a spoken contract at first contact with a relevant ATC or FISO unit. When the controller announces the service, you must repeat it back to them. Inside controlled airspace, ATC will also advise you're under a radar control service. This is a historic UK term and just means that you're under a radar control and must follow the instructions of ATC. Note that if VFR in Class D airspace, the term radar control does not actually mean ATC are applying formal separation between you and other traffic, even if perhaps the term implies as such. There's a variation between airports in terms of how closely VFR traffic in Class D is managed. Some units will treat their airspace more like Class C. Others may place more reliance on passing traffic information and allowing VFR flights to maintain their own separation. If you depart from an airfield within controlled airspace, you will automatically be under radar control, so it's rarely explicitly stated. But if you enter controlled airspace from uncontrolled airspace, the controller will announce
November 1 Alpha Bravo, radar control.
And you must respond
Radar control, November 1 Alpha Bravo.
All the other services are only available outside controlled airspace. The first is procedural service. It's provided to aircraft performing IFR procedures, that is, approaches, departures, and holds, outside controlled airspace, and to en route aircraft passing through those procedures where the controller has no radar. The controller has blocks of airspace and altitudes, and effectively he can only allow one aircraft into each block at a time. However, there's no requirement for VFR aircraft or IFR aircraft not taking a service to be talking to the same controller, so separation is only provided from other known aircraft. If you're in VMC, you must keep a careful lookout for other traffic. The next is deconfliction service. This is provided by a radar controller to IFR aircraft outside controlled airspace. The controller will give the aircraft vectors to avoid traffic seen on radar, whether the controller has them identified or not. The aircraft is not obliged to follow the vectors, but if they don't, the service is terminated, usually replaced by a traffic service. As the controller cannot give instructions to other aircraft, particularly those not in radio contact, the aircraft receiving the service gets all the maneuvering instructions, which can end up with a much longer route with many turns and doglegs. For this reason, most G aircraft, even those under IFR, do not request this service. It's mainly used by air transport, which is usually flying higher and away from the main routes, and therefore receives few vectors. Then we have traffic service. It's available to IFR and VFR traffic outside controlled airspace, and it's probably the closest we get to what you might get in the rest of Europe from Flight Information Service or in the US and elsewhere as flight following. To my mind, it's the most useful of the services available. The controller will tell you about other traffic seen on radar, but will not give you vectors to avoid. Generally, the first advice you will be given is when the other aircraft is about 6 miles away, and you'll be told which way it's going. So a typical call would be
Delta Charlie Delta, traffic 1 o'clock, 6 miles, indicating 100 feet below, passing left to right.
That might be all you hear, but if it gets much closer, you might get a call like
Delta Charlie Delta, previously mentioned traffic, now 1 o'clock, 2 miles, still indicating 100 below.
If they say
No height information.
it means that there's no altitude readout because either they don't have a transponder or it doesn't have mode Charlie. When given advice on other aircraft, the response should be either
Traffic in sight
or.
traffic not sighted.
The controller might add an if not sighted suggestion, as they can't just watch as two aircraft collide. The traffic controller will probably also warn you if you're getting close to airspace, though it remains your responsibility to remain outside. Nobody told me is not an acceptable excuse. If you ask for traffic service, you may not always get it. On a bright weekend day when everyone is out and about, there may just be more traffic than the controller can manage. This is, of course, ironic, as it's the very time you need it most. But if controller workload is too high, then it can't be provided. You may also be told that the service is limited for a number of reasons.
You are close to the base of my radar cover. You are close to the edge of my radar cover. You are close to my radar overhead. There is weather clutter, squawking aircraft only.
You may also be told of multiple contacts, for example, near a gliding site, and to keep a good lookout. The next service down the list is basic service, and as the name suggests, it's very basic. There's no requirement for a controller to radar identify a flight subject to basic service. ATC units with radar may provide a basic service, but most of the time they'll not be monitoring you. Don't be lulled into a false sense of security by the fact you're talking to a controller. You might get very limited traffic information of a general nature. If you're inbound to or outbound from an airfield, you might be told of other aircraft which might conflict. For example, you might be told that a Spitfire has recently departed to the east, last known to be climbing to 2,000 feet. They might also tell you of an activity or NOTAM which might affect your flight, such as
Gliding is scheduled.
or
Danger Area 123 is notified as active.
I think it's sometimes used only because the controller or flight information officer is obliged to offer a service contract and basic is all that's available. Nonetheless, they will say
Basic service.
and you must respond
Basic service.
so that everyone knows what the agreement is. Sometimes you'll be receiving a basic service and still be asked to squawk a particular code. This is partly to tell other providers who you're talking to. So, for example, if you have the London Information Squawk and you approach or penetrate controlled airspace, the controller for that airspace can call your service provider and pass instructions to get you out of airspace. And partly because the provider of a basic service may well have radar, and it's helpful for them to be able to see you, even though you're not being given a radar service. This sometimes results in them passing traffic information even though you're on a basic service. This is usually phrased as traffic believed to be you has traffic in its 2 o'clock at 2 miles on a converging heading. Again, this is because if they notice a conflict, they can't just watch a collision take place when they have the capacity to prevent it. This is known in law as the controller's duty of care. Quite often, you'll be asked, what service do you require? You should normally answer either traffic service or basic service, though possibly deconfliction service if you're under IFR outside controlled airspace. So, those are all the services. Now I'm going to talk about the frequency monitoring codes, very often referred to as listening squawks. These are a pairing of a transponder code and a frequency provided by very nearly all Class D zones. They're not compulsory, but they're recommended to any aircraft flying close to but not in the zones. You squawk the squawk and listen out on the radio frequency, which is normally the approach controller for the zone. Then, if you enter the zone accidentally, or in some cases look like you might be going to do so, they'll call you. In these days of almost universal Mode S, they'll call you by call sign. But if you don't have Mode S, they will try to call you by position.
Aircraft flying to the south of Bath, heading 260 degrees at 2,500 feet. Are you receiving me?
The whole point of listening squawks is that you listen in case you're called, but you don't initiate a call. The main thing to remember is to revert your squawk back to 7,000 or 2,000 before changing to any other frequency. While we're on the subject of squawking, let's talk about what you squawk if you've nothing else to squawk. This is the same as the rest of Europe, 7,000 if you're VFR and 2,000 if you're IFR. However, as I'll be explaining in greater length in the third video in this short sequence, which is about IFR, you can be VFR or IFR in the UK outside controlled airspace according to your own preference with no need for a flight plan clearance or explicit statement. Thus, when you're released by a service provider, they may not know or care whether you plan to continue VFR or IFR. So they don't, or at least shouldn't, tell you to squawk 7,000. They will tell you to
squawk conspicuity,
which means that you should squawk whichever of 7,000 or 2,000 is appropriate. So the first oddity of our system is these different services and the contract you must enter. The second thing that people find odd is that with the exception of the military, we do not have a state provider of air traffic services. It's all done by private companies. There are well over 100 different private providers of air traffic services. That means that there's no coherent provision of services. It's not unusual to have a choice of people you could talk to, and often there's no radar service available. If you're from Europe, you're probably used to there being one state-provided flight information service, such as Paris Information or Langen Information, with clear boundary lines, which gives you a radar service and then seamlessly passes on to the next FIS unit, or sometimes to a zone if you're passing through or nearby. In your home country, that FIS can very often clear you through a string of zones, restricted areas and danger areas, or will tell you which ones to avoid. They'll also call out traffic if it's going to get close. We have nothing like that in the UK. We do have London and Scottish Information, but they don't have radar. Scottish Information is provided by Scottish controls at higher altitudes, and then they do have radar, but that never happens in London Information, which covers England and Wales. London and Scottish Information are very useful for some things. You can ask them about the weather or whether some danger areas are active. You can even get them to relay messages to your destination airfield. They might coordinate a handover when crossing the FAR boundary and remain aware of you when over water. And they may give you generalized warnings about the existence of controlled and special use airspace and danger areas on your route. But they normally won't tell you about traffic, and they usually won't tell you that your track is taking you into a danger area or controlled airspace. They sometimes do, but you can't rely on it. Unlike the FIS services in most of the rest of Europe, they are not usually the best service to be talking to. Misunderstandings of the purpose and function of London and Scottish Information is cited as the principal reason why visiting pilots infringe UK airspace, with all the regrettable consequences of that. It's really important that you understand that they do not provide the service you're used to in your home country. They'll not take responsibility for airspace crossings, and they will generally not warn you of traffic. A service that may be of better use is the lower airspace radar service, which both helps you with conflicting traffic and with airspace. LARS, mostly with one major exception, uses spare capacity of controllers who are responsible for approach control at airports and military airfields. That means that each service provider is associated with a particular civil or military airfield, and therefore the service will only be provided when that particular unit is open. When the provider is a civil airport, that generally means long days, 7 days a week. But when it's the military airfield, it might only be relatively short opening hours and only on working days. Furthermore, because it uses spare capacity, it's not uncommon for the controller to be fully occupied with aircraft using his or her own airfield or crossing its airspace, and then the first service to be downgraded or removed is the LARS service outside controlled airspace. LARS units do not generally receive any flight plan information about you, so you'll have to introduce yourself with registration, type, departure and destination, position, altitude and intentions every time. Units may or may not hand you over to the next unit. If they do, then you won't need to repeat all the flight information. It's like being handed from Paris to Bordeaux or whatever. but it's more common that you have to free call the next unit and tell them all about yourself from scratch. The instruction from ATC to free call another unit is a UK term to indicate that the next unit is not aware of your flight details. If a controller states contact another unit, that normally means they've passed your details and the next unit is expecting your call. All these factors mean that the Lars service is patchy, disjointed, poorly connected, and unreliable. This is not the fault of the units providing the service. It's because there's very little public funding for it. It mainly falls upon private companies to provide, and very often it just isn't worth their while. The one notable exception to everything I've said about Lars is to be found in the southeast of England, the area around London. That area is served by Farnborough Radar, which is a dedicated, properly funded Lars unit, which is there primarily to protect the major airports from airspace infringements. The service is available for long hours, 7 days a week, and is similar in some ways to a European FIS, except that it's only available outside controlled airspace. You still need to negotiate your own clearance through any zone. Farnborough Radar has 3 areas: north, east, and west. They sometimes have different controllers. Sometimes one controller covers 2 or all 3 areas. Occasionally, 1 or more areas is notamed as unavailable, presumably because of controller shortages. There are a couple of other services that you might come across. Western Radar covers Wales and the southwest of England and provides deconfliction, traffic, and basic services. It's supposed to only operate above flight level 100, technically Middle Airspace Radar Service, or MARS, but I've spoken to it lower than that when travelling to and from Ireland. Similarly, you can talk to Anglia Radar over the North Sea and London Mill in the northeast. There's one last service I'm going to tell you about. We have a superb distress and diversion service operated by the military. If you call on 1215, they'll not only reply to you, but will find your position with a combination of radio triangulation and radar. Their call sign is London Centre, but they will usually be the calming voice that comes on the radio when you transmit on 1215, even if you don't address them by name. They hold prime responsibility for aircraft in distress or in a state of urgency. Even if you're not talking to them directly, they will coordinate any emergency response. They know the weather and runway state of all military airfields and can quickly liaise with others. If you're in trouble or even just lost in the UK, outside controlled airspace, you almost invariably get the best result by talking to them. That's the end of my second video on visiting the UK. The CAA's Skyway Code is an excellent, simple but comprehensive document which goes into much more detail than I can here. And the Airspace and Safety Initiative has many helpful articles both about flying in the UK in general and also highlighting particular issues and hotspots. Links to both can be found below. The next video is about IFR. If you never fly IFR, you should skip that one and move on to the fourth one about the various permissions you need to fly in the UK. I'll see you in whichever one you choose next.